A man is walking his dog through the woods. He spots what he thinks is a young girl sleeping. To his horror, he realizes she's dead. The unknown girl has multiple stab wounds. But despite a fingertip search of the crime scene, forensic officers find no other obvious evidence. Can the police track down the killer before he strikes again? The police are faced with a mystery, but before they can try and solve this gruesome murder, they first have to discover who the poor girl is and hope that her background will lead them to the killer. Catching a killer requires conclusive forensic evidence. From clues at the scene of the crime to minute examination in the forensics lab, from the cold reality of the pathologist's table to DNA sampling, digital analysis, each piece of killer evidence brings the murderer closer to justice. A teenage girl is found dead in the woods with multiple stab wounds. The police rush to the scene and search for clues which will help identify the killer. The most important and crucial piece of evidence is the dead body itself, which the police hope will reveal how she was killed. Detective Superintendent Paul Barton is the man in charge of the investigation.
I received a call probably about 8:30, 8:45 that morning from the on-call senior investigating officer notifying me exactly what's taken place. And at that point, I ensured that they had sufficient resources to deal with that investigation.
Detective Superintendent Barton receives his first report describing the crime scene.
So when officers arrived at the scene, they were directed into some undergrowth within the sports centre, just off the natural sort of footpath that walks from the city centre into the sports centre. And what they saw was a young female, fully clothed, lying face down, almost in the recovery position, with apparent blood coming from around her neck area.
Officers must cordon off the area to preserve the evidence.
The best thing that the first officers on the scene can do is to step back, establish cordons, make sure that they've got enough of their own staff and personnel to be able to man that cordon appropriately, and then hopefully the forensic investigation team will be there as quickly as they possibly can.
First thing I'm asking myself is that the deposition site? You know, has the victim been murdered in one location and deposited in that particular location? So you're considering other scenes. So you'd be looking for things like drag marks, for example. You know, is there anything to suggest that the body has been moved to where it's now being located?
Another clue can be found by examining how far the blood has spread and the pattern it forms.
So in a bloodstain pattern sense, one of the ways that we will address that is whether or not the patterns of blood at the crime scene are indicative of assault. So patterns that you might see at a kill site or an assault site might include things like impact spatter. That's where I've delivered blows into wet blood. So if I bludgeon someone, that might create an impact pattern. At a deposition site, then those activities are not synonymous with that action, but they're more likely to produce bloodstains such as pooling or staining that is indicative of them having just simply been deposited there rather than violently assaulted there. And it's that difference between the patterns at an attack site and a deposition site that can help you to steer the police in identifying which one they're looking at.
Blood is found on the leaves surrounding the girl's body, which indicates this was the attack site.
There's a lot of foliage within that particular scene, so you can see at that particular crime scene there was a lot of blood spattering around leaves and trees.
Investigators now look for a murder weapon.
So we believe a knife was used. There was no knife found at the scene, but that's not surprising. A knife is quite an easy item to dispose of. In most homicide investigations, we would look at the location of where the assault has taken place and it'd be quite common for us to lift up a lot of drains and see what's in there. And you'd be surprised how many knives we come across when we're searching drains, but they're never really linked to the actual murder that you're looking at.
Further searches of the site provide scant evidence as to the killer's identity, but the detectives are convinced of one thing.
The location for me was really significant. For me, this showed this was somebody who potentially had local knowledge, because they were confident enough to carry out this horrendous crime in a very public place, albeit it was hidden from normal view on the footpath. But it was somebody who knew this area quite well, and so again, you're starting to build up a picture as to who may be responsible for this.
The post-mortem finds 27 stab wounds. Some indicate the girl put up a fight.
So when you have wounds to hands and arms, that often indicates that the victim has put up a fight. So wounds to the front of the arms or the back of the arms will often be because someone has tried to stop the blade coming at them. So it would indicate that she put up a fight to try and protect herself, but ultimately the other wounds, which were fatal, would have overcome her.
So you can only imagine what this victim was going through. It must have been horrendous with this attacker coming at her with a knife, and she's trying to defend herself.
The fatal wound severed an artery in the girl's neck.
Often that will cause blood to spurt from the neck. That will then cover the person who is causing the attack in blood. Now, sometimes that might be a lot of blood, or sometimes it may just be spots of blood, but that would be very important for the police because they will want to use the DNA from that blood to link the attacker to the deceased.
So the clothing in that particular case would have been at the forefront of the investigation, because if we have projected bloodstains, impact patterns, any sort of contact transfer stains, then that demonstrates that the wearer has been intimately involved with that person as and after they've been injured.
The defence might say that the reason that there's blood on the assailant's clothing is because they discovered them like that, and therefore that's caused blood transfer. However, if the clothing shows that there's an arterial spray pattern of blood being expelled from the victim's body, then that can only be caused because the assailant was there at the time that the injuries were caused. Therefore, the assailant caused those injuries.
The girl wasn't carrying any form of ID, so the team of detectives checked the reports of missing persons.
And sure enough, in the last 24 hours, Lucy McHugh had been reported missing by her mother. The clothing that was described, the age and the build, the colour of hair, we were fairly confident at that point that our victim was Lucy McHugh. And so we then have the unenviable task of then sending officers to Lucy's parents' address to pass on that extremely sad news that we found her daughter, but unfortunately her daughter's been murdered.
The evidence suggests that 13-year-old Lucy knew the person who killed her.
But what the injuries showed me was this was very personalised towards the victim, and it suggests that she probably knew her attacker. For that person to lure her to that particular location in itself, there was no suggestion that she'd been dragged into that location. So this was somebody who knew her.
Very few murders in this country are committed by strangers. They are committed by people we know. So inevitably, when you come across a victim, you're going to say, well, first of all, who does she know? You know, who possibly could have committed this? And in the case of a female victim, you're going to say, what male? Because in most instances, it's a male offender. In this instance, the type of attack indicates it was an intimate, violent act. And the location of the attack further corroborates that, because this is a location where she was unlikely to wander by accident. This was a location where clearly she'd been invited to or was there by arrangement. And of course, arrangements are made between friends, between associates, between lovers, between partners. So in this instance, everything pointed to the fact that this tragic victim knew the perpetrator, knew her murderer.
With her parents' permission, family liaison officers search Lucy's bedroom. They find Lucy's diary. And then the family's tablet, which she may have used just before her disappearance.
When we opened up the diary, the contents of that diary were extremely disturbing. And what it showed was that she had been sexually abused by a male called Stephen Nicholson.
A former tattoo artist with a troubled past, 23-year-old Stephen Nicholson is a close family friend.
He was a lodger with them up until a week before Lucy was discovered in the woods. And so by now you're starting to think, well, this is extremely strange. You know, we've got this person who has allegedly been sexually abusing Lucy. He's now vanished from the family home a week before.
With Lucy sleeping just meters away from him, Nicholson has the perfect opportunity to manipulate and abuse her.
It's a profoundly sad and tragic situation. We know from reading Lucy's diaries that she believed that she was in a relationship with Nicholson. She told her friends in school this. Clearly this is perverse and it's illegal.
Lucy would have been quite impressionable. And I do wonder whether, compared to her peers of her own age, Nicholson would have stood out. He would have probably appeared quite elusive and quite mysterious, which leaves her to be quite vulnerable, and it leaves him the perfect opportunity to try and manipulate her.
The diary is crucial evidence. It shows that less than a month after moving in, Nicholson had sex with Lucy, who was then just 12 years old.
It would have been quite obvious to anybody who's following Lucy's life that something profound is happening, something dark is happening in the background. She recedes from being a bubbly character into something who's introverted, somebody who's living on the edge, who is suffering anxiety. And I think it's quite clear that she herself knew that something incredibly untoward and wrong was happening. And she writes in her diary, I think it's very prophetic, she says, "Whatever this is, it has to end."
When the police dig into Nicholson's background, they find more disturbing events.
So when he was 13 years of age, he was in a children's home and he got into an altercation with the staff there, where he barricaded himself in the room, set fire to the building, and actually threatened a member of staff with a knife, and then set off in their car. So again, this is really starting to build up a concerning picture of this individual. This is somebody who's got an unhealthy interest in children, but also he's used to using knives.
We know that Nicholson was brought up in care, and that around 2/3 of children in this situation suffer some form of physical or sexual abuse. And victims of physical abuse often become quite violent themselves. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, they tend to emulate or mimic patterns that they've seen, and they think it's a healthy way of conflict resolution. But also because they believe that there has to be this power dynamic, this struggle in relationships, that they want to be the one that's in control and the one that's dominating.
The police released some information about the murder to the media. On the day Lucy disappeared, Nicholson had texted her mom. Now he calls her stepdad, who took him in as a lodger.
And, you know, he sort of said, "Oh, I've just heard about it on the radio. You know, is there anything I could do? I hear they may have seen somebody on a bike down by the sports centre." And it was really interesting because he was giving them information that we hadn't actually put out to the media at that point. So only he could have known about that. So again, that raised our suspicion.
The police are desperate to arrest and interrogate Nicholson before he can destroy crucial forensic evidence that might prove he murdered Lucy. So far, the police know that Lucy was killed in a frenzied knife attack in the woods. Her diary reveals she was being sexually abused in the run-up to her death. And looking at her tablet, police suspect she messaged her killer just hours earlier. Police believe that Nicholson could be the killer, and they want him in custody as they hunt for crucial forensic evidence. The lead detective has sent his team to question Stephen Nicholson's associates.
Fortunately, within 24 hours, Nicholson was located at nearby Millbrook railway station, where he was arrested without incident and brought into custody.
The police are surprised when Nicholson cooperates.
He explained to us what his movements were leading up to his arrest, which was really, really useful because obviously what we then have is an account that he's stuck to that we can then either confirm or disprove.
The clock is now ticking. Barton and his team have 4 days in which to charge Nicholson or release him.
In this country, there are significant protections for the defendant in custody. You only have 96 hours, 4 days, to interview the potential perpetrator, the suspect, after which you have to release them. That gives you a very limited time to gather the evidence that needs to be gathered in that window, else it might be destroyed, and particularly forensic evidence or other digital evidence.
At the time of Lucy's murder, Nicholson had called in sick from work. He claims he went to visit an elderly man he sometimes cared for at around 9 a.m, roughly the time Lucy left home.
And what was chilling for me was that this old boy lived, within a stone's throw of Southampton Sports Centre. So by now he's actually putting himself in that area, and you think, well, maybe he's trying to be clever, because if somebody has spotted him, quite distinctive, he has tattoos on his face.
Nicholson claims he stayed at the man's house for a few hours before cycling home. If his account can be verified, it will rule him out as Lucy's killer.
The first thing we can do is knock on that address and speak to the old boy. Now, sadly, that person has all sorts of health issues. Their sight isn't particularly good, their hearing isn't particularly good, and they also have dementia. And so it would be very tricky to get a true account from that individual, and quite somebody who's quite easy to influence, I would suggest. And so we spoke to that individual. They confirmed that Nicholson had been there that day and couldn't really add anything extra to that.
So far, Nicholson's alibi is holding up. Meanwhile, police analyse a vast trawl of available CCTV in the area. They're determined to see who Lucy met that morning. But it's a daunting task. There's more than 11,000 hours of footage to wade through.
The role of CCTV is such an important role in any investigation, I would suggest, nowadays. But it's also a gutty role. It's spending hours and hours locked almost in a dark room, looking at monitors, training your eye to try and pick up any particular detail. You cannot afford to take your eye off the ball in this particular situation.
The CCTV evidence is now crucial in piecing Lucy's day together. The first sighting of her is soon after she left home the morning of her murder.
Within a couple of minutes from 9 o'clock that morning, we do pick up Lucy from a residential CCTV camera very close to her home address. And she's walking in the natural direction, I would suggest, up Copsford Road towards the sports centre.
The analysts notice how quickly Lucy is walking.
She was walking with purpose, we would say. And it was interesting because when we found Lucy, she was wearing a fairly cheap wristwatch. And what we established was that she'd actually borrowed that from her brother that morning because she didn't have her phone. Her mother had actually taken her mobile phone off of her as a form of punishment. I think Lucy had been playing up. And obviously most teenagers use their phones as their clocks, their watches. And for me, that suggested that Lucy wanted to know what the time was because she needed to be somewhere at a particular time. And so from having that start point, officers can then start working their way up through CCTV cameras. And sure enough, we pick her up on various cameras.
It's a warm summer's day, and the analysts are momentarily thrown off the scent when Lucy removes her jacket.
And this causes some problems for the officers because they're very trained on looking at this particular image that they've seen of Lucy that's got this kind of black and white varsity jacket on. And then suddenly her appearance has changed slightly, so they have to almost retrain their eye and their brain to look for a different image. But sure enough, they find her again.
Their final sighting is of Lucy outside a shop near the site of her murder, but they don't see her with anyone else. With Nicholson's custody deadline approaching, the pressure is on to find the evidence to charge him.
So Nicholson effectively said that he had been to this address from about 9 o'clock that morning through till about 11 o'clock. I popped out to the Tesco Express just after 9 to get the old boy some biscuits and some tobacco. It's probably on CCTV, you'll find that there. So sure enough, that's what we do.
The CCTV is again crucial evidence. Detectives use it to check Nicholson's alibi.
And actually, in that CCTV, what's particularly chilling is it's the same camera that picks up Lucy only 28 minutes later. But what you see is Nicholson inside the store with a large Tesco bag for life where he's bought these goodies for this old boy. And he was very confident. He said, you can ask the old boy, he'll confirm that I was there. check my phone. I know you can do that. It will show that my phone hasn't moved, so I've been there.
Nicholson is playing a clever game. He knows his phone was at the elderly man's house at the time of Lucy's murder, and this gives the impression he was there too. The police now want to analyse his handset.
And I think that's when he makes his first mistake, because he says, I don't have my phone anymore. And we're like, well, why not? And he explains that on his way home, he actually drops it and it smashes. And instead of taking it in for repair, he decides to throw it. So again, you ask the question, well, why would you do that? And he came up with some excuse to say, oh, there'll be some of my drug dealers are on there, you know, and I don't want to get them into trouble and I'll get harmed if I find out who they are, so it was easier to throw the phone. And we're thinking, this is just ridiculous. Why are you saying that?
But even without the physical handset, detectives can obtain his call and message logs from his service provider. This new piece of evidence can indicate whether he's with the phone at the elderly man's house.
So the call data records literally only contain data about the connection to the network. So it's the date and time, the telephone numbers involved, and the type of connection, whether it's data or voice.
The detectives used this information to compare Nicholson's normal call and messaging habits against the period he claims he was at the man's house.
If suspects are forensically aware, there's a few techniques that they might use. They might turn the phone off or leave it in a different location. But by looking at pattern of life activity on the phone, we can see, we might be able to draw conclusions that, you know, during a particular point in time that would normally have a reasonable amount of activity, if there's no activity, we can spot that gap in pattern of life or change in pattern of life.
Well, modern handsets and phones, they're a window into all of our lives, who we're calling, how we're living a life, you know, our actually daily movements, even, you know, our heartbeat. So by throwing your mobile phone away, that's not throwing away the data. The data's still with the service provider, you know, when you're phoning, who you're phoning, you know, where you are, where you're traveling to. So the modern phone literally is the best spyware police could ever have on an individual, and to think that by merely throwing it away, you're going to deter the police from their investigations, well, you'd be very wrong.
In Nicholson's case, the phone data throws his alibi into doubt.
We could show that over a period of time, on average, if he received a text message, he would respond within 7 minutes. On this particular occasion, he'd received text messages and I think some phone calls, and there was no response over that 3-hour period. So for me, that suggests he's not with his phone. His phone is that address, but he's elsewhere.
It's a breakthrough, but nowhere near enough. They need to put him at the scene of the crime. They turn again to the CCTV to see if they can spot him.
Can we pick him up on his bike, which is what he sees on? Sure enough, we do, and he's on the route that he explains, going toward the old boy's house. And then on the way back, he gives us a route, and again, we pick him up.
His clothes appear clean, but a plastic bag could contain any blood-stained items. Analysts also notice he disappears from the cameras before reappearing further along the route.
And for me, that's highly suspicious because it suggests that he's taken a diversion from the route that he's told us. Or there's something wrong with CCTV. Why is he not appearing on it?
It's suspicious, but again, it's not hard evidence, and soon they'll have to release him. Digital forensics officers have now examined the tablet found in Lucy's bedroom. They confirm she had been using it the night before she disappeared.
And we could see that she'd been on Facebook Messenger the night before, and we believe she was trying to contact Nicholson. But worryingly, the conversation from Lucy's side had been completely erased. And so we were left wondering, well, what were the contents of that? You know, was she contacting Nicholson? Were they arranging to meet?
Nicholson tells the officers she demanded a meeting with him, saying she was pregnant, but he dismissed it as a teenage infatuation and blocked her. Police ask Nicholson for his Facebook password so they can access the conversation from his side.
And that was the first time in his interview where he closed up. He did not want to give us his password. He refused to do so. And for me, again, that starts ringing alarm bells because up until now, he was confident. He was happy to tell us his movements, what he was doing, check my phone, check CCTV. When we say, can we check your Facebook account? He says no.
Nicholson's confidence begins to wane as the evidence against him grows. Lucy's diary shows he was abusing her. He was near the murder scene that morning. Data from his phone casts doubt on his alibi. And he appears to have lied about his route home. It all amounts to important circumstantial evidence, but it's not enough to charge him.
The clock is ticking, timing is against us. He's given an account, he's told us where he was. We can't disprove that at this particular stage. So I'm starting to panic now. I'm thinking, I'm confident he's responsible for the murder of Lucy, but I can't prove it at the moment. And the last thing I want to do is let him back out on the streets where he's a danger to other people.
The police are desperate for a breakthrough. They want to keep him under lock and key while they amass further evidence against him. Lucy's diary, deleted Facebook messages, and CCTV evidence suggest she was hurrying to meet Stephen Nicholson. Nicholson was in the area, and his phone records cast doubt on his alibi. But this evidence is circumstantial, and there are just hours to go before police must release him. However, Nicholson's refusal to hand over his Facebook Messenger password is about to help the police in unexpected ways.
So I start looking at what I can do to try and get access to Facebook. So I make inquiries through the FBI and the Department of Justice in the US to say, look, this is the problem we have. This is the serious offence we're dealing with. Can you assist me in getting into Facebook? And Facebook were actually as helpful as they could be, but they're an American company. They have different laws to us, and you can't just write an authority and get access. There's various hurdles you have to go through. And these things can take weeks, if not months. And we didn't have weeks or months, we had hours left on the clock. And so at this point, we're now starting to think outside of the box. What can we do to keep him in custody? Because I do not want to let Nicholson out on the streets. And it's at that point, we have this kind of light bulb moment where my colleague comes in. He's my tactical interview manager. And he says, boss, have you heard of Ripper, Section 49? So he explained to me that this is a particular piece of legislation mainly used in terrorist offences, but also for online grooming offences with paedophiles, where police are keen to access somebody's account using their password. And if they refuse to give their password, they actually commit a criminal offence under the Ripper legislation.
So desperate is Nicholson to keep his Facebook messages hidden that he pleads guilty to the Section 49 offence and is sentenced to 14 months in jail.
And that was just fantastic for us because it took the pressure off us. That gives us enough time to start waiting for the forensic evidence to come in, start looking at further inquiries that we can do, try and put him in the same location as Lucy at that particular crime scene.
The team turned their attention again to the CCTV. They've seen Nicholson cycling with a Tesco bag. Then the cameras lose him before he reappears further along the road. Crucially, they spot something different about the bag.
And when we pick him up at a later camera, we look closely at the image again, and we would say that the contents, whatever that was in his Tesco bag for life, was a lot lighter than when we last saw him.
The detectives now suspect Nicholson has dumped his blood-soaked clothes somewhere out of sight of the CCTV cameras. Location data on his phone might show where he went, but Nicholson claims to have thrown it away.
We were scratching our heads thinking, well, what are we going to do? This is a real team effort. And one of our members of our intelligence unit came forward and said, look, I've just been on a course and I've learned that if you don't have a handset, you can still mirror a handset. If you get the identical one and you can download all the contents from the cloud onto that handset. Why don't we try and do that?
You can buy a replacement phone, and just like a home user transitioning from one phone to another, you synchronize the new phone to the online data stored under that user's account.
If one of the apps is a fitness tracking app, it might reveal where Nicholson went.
So just like the GPS in your car, your satellite navigation system, GPS in mobile phones will use the same technology. They receive a signal from the satellites and they calculate their position based on that.
For the plan to work, detectives need Nicholson's App Store password. This time, they're in luck.
We spoke to Richard Elms, who was Lucy's stepdad, who was very good friends with Nicholson and obviously put him up at the house. And they were gamers together. They would often, go on gaming and play against each other. And fortunately for us, he knew Nicholson's Google password, so he was able to provide us with that, which allowed us access to the cloud and download the data.
Nicholson did have a fitness app, and it provides police with key evidence. The data showed he'd headed towards Woodland for a short time on his way home, but his exact route was still unclear.
In GPS apps, terrain and environment is very important, because if you haven't got sight of the satellites, the phone can't pin itself, can't identify where it is. So it will try and hazard a guess until it receives a signal again, but over a period of time that will get less and less accurate.
Without an exact location, Detective Superintendent Barton will need a large search team.
And it's going to take something like 14 officers working 2 shifts a day over 80 days to search that area. And it's going to be expensive.
He's about to take a huge risk. If he puts together a team to search the woodland and they come up with nothing, he could soon run out of resources to catch Lucy's killer.
I think people are under the real misconception that an investigation like this, as traumatic as this, as important as this, will have unlimited resources. They have to prioritise manpower, budgets and resources. And in a case as complex as that, these decisions can be the difference between getting their man and not.
Encouraged by the location data retrieved from Nicholson's fitness app, Detective Superintendent Barton decides to press ahead with the search for Nicholson's clothing.
And so, I took a deep breath, spoke to my big bosses and said, look, we've got to do this. And we agreed to authorise the search of that area.
Dozens of officers get to work with a painstaking fingertip search of the area. Their efforts bring the total area searched in the hunt for Lucy's killer to more than 30,000 square metres. Finally, they get their breakthrough.
We found a blue Russell Athletic hoodie that had apparent blood on the outside of the garment. Inside the pockets were some blue latex gloves that had apparent blood on them.
If the forensic tests prove the blood is Lucy's and also find traces of Nicholson's on the clothing, it's compelling evidence that he killed her. The key to this is DNA.
DNA profiling has huge advantages, so particularly in terms of attacks where there is blood spilled. Potentially you've got a huge source of biometric identification material.
The only fear is whether the evidence has deteriorated.
What you've got to remember is this is some 9 weeks after Lucy's body was found that we've now found these items. And so you've got the weather to contend with, has it been damaged through rain? Has there been animal interference? Have foxes got out there? Have they got to some of those items and potentially damaged some of that forensic evidence that we might be recovering?
While they're waiting for the analysis, the team press on with more old-fashioned ways to prove the link.
It's not good enough for an officer just to go through the usual routes, to go through the forensic routes, to knock on the usual doors. They have to think laterally. They have to kind of consider what defences, what ideas, what even preposterous suggestions a defendant might come up. And they've got to anticipate that and deflect that. So a good detective has to anticipate what the defence will claim. A good detective has to anticipate even the ludicrous alibis a defendant might suggest. And that's the kind of thinking which a modern detective is required.
The search team also found tracksuit bottoms with the hoodie in the woods.
We had some black and white patterned tracksuit bottoms, which again had apparent blood on them. Now, when we did some searches on Nicholson's social media, we came across a photograph of him posing with a young child, we think probably a relative. And sure enough, these tracksuit bottoms matched the ones that we had recovered. And I'm thinking, this is brilliant.
The hoodie is harder to link to Nicholson. The detectives used the batch number on the label to ask the manufacturer where they were sold.
And to my surprise, what we established was that only 2 had been sold in Hampshire, And we actually were able to get the credit card numbers of the people that purchased those so that we can make some inquiries with those individuals. And the first call we made to the first purchaser, they said, oh yeah, I remember buying that for my husband. He still got it. You're welcome to come and see him if you need to. And we're, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. The next person we spoke to was really interesting because what she said was, oh yeah, I bought that for my boyfriend, but I haven't seen it for a while. I think he left it at this old boy's address in Southampton where Nicholson had been looking after. And there was a connection there. And so by now we're thinking, this is great. You know, this now links this item to that address where Nicholson says he was.
Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs in a case are simply through old-fashioned police work. It's following the thread of a clue to its ultimate conclusion, and by linking a batch number of a hoodie to a friend of Nicholson's, classic. And that's key work. Doesn't get you across the line, but it makes a difference. Added that to forensics, good forensic work, and then you might have cracked the case.
Placing the blue hoodie at the flat that Nicholson says he visited on the morning of Lucy's murder is another strong piece of evidence. A stepping stone in securing a conviction. But without solid forensic analysis to prove the blood on the hoodie is Lucy's, the case could still fall apart. Police are convinced Stephen Nicholson is the murderer. Evidence from her diary, deleted messages, CCTV, and phone records all point to the family lodger. Phone tracking data has led police into Woodland, where they found blood-stained clothes they're sure are his. Now they must wait for the blood and DNA analysis from the forensic lab. Their main worry is that the DNA evidence on the clothing will not have survived in the damp woodland. The success of the entire case is now in the balance.
DNA can be quite robust, but it depends very much on the circumstances that occur to it after its deposition. So in this case, we're thinking about blood on an item of clothing. Blood on an item of clothing that dries very quickly and is then unaffected by other environmental factors will probably stay there with a good chance of getting a wonderful DNA profile from it for an indefinite period, I would suggest. Blood on an item of clothing that's damp and then exposed to temperature changes, so if it warms up for a bit, you're encouraging the opportunity for bacteria to start to feed, if you like, on the blood and then to replicate themselves. And every time something like that happens, they're actually ingesting the blood and breaking down the potential for you to be able to find a profile from the DNA molecules that are within the blood itself. Consequently, there are quite a few variables that will affect the likelihood of getting a DNA profile from something after an amount of time.
Days later, the results of the forensic tests come in.
We get the phone call that we've all been waiting for, and that's from the lab, and that's to give us the news that actually there is a forensic link between that clothing, Stephen Nicholson, and Lucy McHugh, and that is fantastic.
Only one person's DNA is recovered from the latex gloves found in the pocket of the hoodie. Scientists calculate it's 1 billion times more likely that it came from Stephen Nicholson than anyone else. They bring Nicholson from prison, where he's serving 14 months for refusing to give them his Facebook password.
So when we then present him with that evidence, his face is a picture, and his jaw literally drops to the ground because he thought he'd literally got away with murder. I didn't think that we would find those items, but we did. And forensically, we can link into those items. He is then charged with Lucy's murder and other associated offences relating to Lucy, and he's then sent for trial at Winchester Crown Court.
Police go public with the murder charge against Nicholson.
His name was all over the local papers and the local TV saying he'd been charged with Lucy's murder. And what happened as a result of that is that somebody also came forward knowing Nicholson, and they disclosed to us that they too had been sexually abused by him when they were 14 years of age. Now, what's quite chilling about this particular allegation is that she too had had a relationship with Nicholson, and he had met her in the same location up at Southampton Sports Centre where they'd have consensual sex together, albeit she was 14 years of age. And there were so many similarities with what she was telling us to what we believe Lucy had gone through, that we were able to convince the Crown Prosecution Service that he should also be charged with sexual activity with a child against that particular victim, and he was.
We have to wonder what kind of person is attracted to young girls like this. Sometimes it's actual paedophiles who are only sexually attracted to young children, and they tend to be loners, they tend to live at the fringes of society. Or sometimes it's people who are just generally sexually promiscuous, and they prey on young girls simply because they see them as easy targets. They're quite easy to potentially manipulate or to impress.
It's not unusual that somebody who commits a crime of sexual abuse goes on to repeat and reoffend, and it appears that he had a pattern of behaviour. So for the police in this investigation, they knew they were battling a number of challenges. One, they had to get justice for Lucy's family, but two, they likely knew there were other victims out there, and three, they knew if they didn't get a conviction like this, then somebody like Nicholson could very well go on to murder again.
On the first day of the trial, prosecutors are finally granted access to Nicholson's Facebook log. They hope to finally discover what Lucy was writing to him the night before she was murdered. But Nicholson had also deleted his end of the conversation before he was first arrested. Now police can only speculate.
We know from reading Lucy's diary entries that as far as she was concerned, she was in a relationship with Nicholson. She was in love with him. We even had her practicing her new signature, Lucy Nicholson. She believed she was going to get married to him, which is really, really sad when you think about it. And obviously Nicholson didn't want this. He didn't want this attention to show that he'd been abusing this child over a period of time in the family home. And we believe that she actually threatened him to say, you know, if you don't continue to see me, I'm going to tell my mum what you've been doing and you're going to get in trouble with the police.
She threatened Nicholson that unless he continued the relationship, she would tell her mother, which would invoke, obviously, trouble from the police. Now that, in anyone's terms, is a clear motive for murder.
This murder was planned. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Nicholson knew what he was going to do on that day. He contacted Lucy the night before. He lured her to that particular location. It's a location he knows very well. He has a change of clothing with him as well, because again, he knows that it's going to be pretty obvious if he's seen cycling away from the scene and he's got bloodstained clothing on him. All of this builds up a picture of somebody who's very cold and calculated, who's decided that he's going to silence Lucy and silence Lucy properly.
When we look at the horrific nature, stab wounds on the face of the victim, I think that really tells us a lot about the mind state of Nicholson at the time. This was a chaotic and frenzied attack. He must have had so much vitriol and scorn and hatred towards his victim at the time.
Even without the Facebook messages, the forensic evidence is strong enough to convince a jury he killed Lucy.
So after a lengthy trial, Nicholson was found guilty by a jury of Lucy's murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years.
Nicholson was also convicted of raping Lucy and for sexual activity with another child. For these offences, he was sentenced to 51 years and 9 months to run concurrently. The commitment and lateral thinking of the entire investigation put Nicholson in the dock for murder. But it was the killer evidence from the blood-soaked clothing that sent him down.
For me, this was a case that was purely down to the forensic evidence linking Nicholson with Lucy's murder. When you look at the crime scene itself, there was very little we could get from it. There wasn't your usual sorts of lines of inquiry that you could do in like house to house in that particular area. There was no CCTV covering the area, so it really had to go back to good old-fashioned detective work, finding out kind of what the links are between Nicholson and Lucy. But most importantly, and as far as the jury were concerned, it was the forensic evidence that secured the conviction of Stephen Nicholson for Lucy's murder.
By throwing out his phone and refusing to hand over his password, Nicholson thought he'd got away with murder. But with dedicated endeavour, the police found the killer evidence. The judge called the investigation groundbreaking and inspired. And it means a murderer will spend the rest of his life behind bars.